You think the world's first kings brought law and order, but do you know the forbidden rituals they hid behind bedroom walls? When we hear the word Sumer, we imagine the birth of civilization, the cradle of writing, the invention of cities, the first laws carved into clay. The Sumerians are praised as humanity's great innovators, the people who transformed scattered villages into mighty urban centers, crowned by towering ziggurats. To modernize, they represent progress, knowledge, and the dawn of order. Yet what if this glowing image hides something far more unsettling? Beneath the hymns to gods and the triumphs of kings, the Sumerians also recorded secrets too scandalous for later civilizations to repeat. Etched into clay tablets and buried for millennia were descriptions of bedroom rituals that fused politics, religion, and sexuality. These were not tales of private indulgence, but structured ceremonies where intimacy itself became a tool of power. Kings were not merely rulers of men. They were expected to embody fertility, to prove their right to govern through forbidden acts that blurred the line between divine worship and human desire. This is the paradox of Sumer, the birthplace of civilization, and at the same time, the birthplace of rituals that sound more like nightmares than noble traditions. The same kings credited with inventing law and justice were also expected to participate in intimate performances that bound them to goddesses and priestesses. These practices, framed as sacred unions, reveal how control extended beyond the battlefield and temple into the most private chambers of life. And the clay tablets that describe them were so explicit, so shocking, that many early translators hesitated to publish their findings. So we must ask, how could the civilization that gave us writing and mathematics also normalize such disturbing rites? How did Sumer's kings craft myths of divine kingship while concealing rituals that reduced women to vessels of legitimacy? And why have these stories remained buried for thousands of years, overshadowed by the sanitized image of noble Sumer? Tonight, we peel back the polished veneer of the first civilization and step into the forbidden world hidden in its bedroom rituals. The myth of glory is only half the story. The other half is carved in clay, waiting to be read. Sumer is often described in glowing terms as humanity's first great civilization. School books celebrate it as the birthplace of writing, agriculture, and monumental architecture. Tourists marvel at reconstructions of ziggurats, those great stepped temples that rose toward the heavens. Historians praise the ingenuity of irrigation canals that turned barren plains into fertile farmland. Above all, Sumer is remembered as the land of order, a society where law and structure first replaced chaos. Its kings, crowned with divine authority, are portrayed as shepherds of their people, guiding humanity into a new age of progress. This story, retold for centuries, forms the myth of Sumer, a golden dawn where humanity took its first steps towards civilization. The image is seductive because it places the Sumerians at the center of human achievement. The first contracts, the first cities, the first codes of law, all of these are attributed to them. In this telling, their rulers were not tyrants but visionaries, chosen by the gods to embody wisdom and justice. They appear in records as guardians of harmony, builders of temples, and protectors of prosperity. But this myth hides a disquieting reality. The same clay tablets that record laws and hymns also whisper of darker truths. In the shadows of their achievements lay rituals where kings proved their right to rule not through speeches or battles, but through intimate performances staged as sacred duties. The myth of noble civilization obscures the fact that sexuality itself was woven into governance. Kingship was never just political, it was embodied, enacted, and tested in ways that shocked later cultures into silence. At the center of this contradiction was the idea of divine kingship. To rule in Sumer was not merely to govern, it was to act as mediator between gods and humans. This role demanded more than military victories or civic projects. It required kings to demonstrate fertility and strength in ceremonies that blurred, the line between the sacred and the forbidden. Ancient hymns celebrate these rituals, yet cloak them in metaphors, praising the king's union with goddesses as proof of divine favor. To the faithful, this confirmed legitimacy. To modern readers, it reveals how deeply sexuality was ritualized as a political tool. The myth of civilization conveniently highlights only half the story. We are taught about the code of Ur-Nammu and the hymns to Inanna, but not about the ritualized bedroom acts those hymns describe in veiled language. We celebrate the king as lawgiver, but ignore that his authority was staged in ceremonies where intimacy was transformed into spectacle. This selective memory has sanitized Sumer into a symbol of progress, stripping away the uncomfortable truths that its own records preserve. The contrast could not be sharper. The ziggurat rising proudly above the city and within its temple chambers, the king enacting rites that would scandalize even his contemporaries in later Mesopotamian cultures. For while Babylonians and Assyrians borrowed much from Sumer, they often buried these more explicit traditions, erasing them from public memory. What survived in clay was buried for millennia, rediscovered only by archaeologists shocked by the candor of cuneiform. Thus, the myth of Sumer as the noble first civilization is both true and incomplete. It is true that they pioneered writing, law, and architecture, but it is incomplete because it silences the darker truths that lay at the core of their kingship. The myth tells us what we want to believe about origins, that progress began in purity. The reality, however, is that progress was entangled with rituals that blurred honor and horror. To move beyond the myth, we must examine those rituals in detail, and that takes us to the heart of Sumerian kingship itself, the forbidden ceremonies where power, fertility, and intimacy collided under the gaze of gods and men. To understand the full scope of Sumerian kingship, we must look beyond crowns, battles, and temples. Power in Sumer was not secured by conquest alone. It was sustained through rituals that fused politics, religion, and sexuality into a single performance. Chief among these was the sacred marriage rite, a ceremony so central to kingship that without it, no ruler could claim divine legitimacy. To the modern mind, it appears shocking. The king joined with a high priestess of the goddess Inanna, enacting a sexual union that symbolized the marriage of heaven and earth. But in ancient Sumer, this was not scandal. It was law, religion, and governance, all fused into one intimate act. The premise was simple but profound. Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility, was believed to sustain the prosperity of the land. Without her favor, crops would fail, flocks would perish, and the people would starve. The king's role was to embody the shepherd of his people, chosen by the goddess to protect and nourish. To prove his worth, he was required to perform the sacred union with Inanna's earthly representative, the high priestess of her temple. In this union, the fertility of the land and the legitimacy of the king were bound together. Clay tablets preserve hymns to this ritual, written with startling clarity. The goddess sings to her king, "Plough my holy vulva, man of my heart." These words, preserved in cuneiform, reveal not metaphorical poetry, but instructions for a literal performance. The king's ability to consummate this ritual was seen as proof of his divine mandate. Success meant abundance for the kingdom. Failure threatened famine and unrest. In this way, intimacy was elevated to a cosmic stage, transforming private acts into matters of public survival. But this ritual was more than symbolic. It was often performed in temple chambers, and evidence suggests it was not always hidden from public knowledge. Priests, attendants, and perhaps even select witnesses may have observed, ensuring that the union was not merely rumor but fact. What we would call a forbidden spectacle was, in Sumer, a sacred duty. Kingship was not only written into law, but enacted in flesh. The implications are disturbing. Women chosen as priestesses were elevated in status, but stripped of autonomy. Their bodies became vessels of divine power, their individuality consumed by the role of goddess incarnate. For them, the ritual was not personal choice, but sacred obligation, demanded by the system that bound religion to politics. The union was hailed as holy, but for the women who embodied Inanna, it was also inescapable. Beyond the sacred marriage, rite, other fertility rituals reinforced this dynamic. Kings were expected to participate in seasonal festivals where symbolic acts of union represented the renewal of life. Some texts describe drinking rites where beer and sexual metaphors merged, reinforcing the king's virility as a sign of the land's fertility. Even agricultural cycles were linked to his intimate performance. The ploughing of fields was mirrored by the ploughing of the goddess's body, imagery that turned farming into a sexualized extension of royal power. Foreign scholars who first translated these tablets were astonished. Many 19th and early 20th century archaeologists refused to publish explicit hymns, fearing scandal. Some even destroyed fragments to protect reputations. Only in recent decades have the full texts been revealed, exposing how explicit Sumerian kingship truly was. What had been celebrated as noble civilization was also built on rituals that modern society would deem forbidden. The paradox deepens when we consider how the Sumerians themselves viewed these rites. To them, the rituals were not shameful but essential. They believed their very survival depended on the king's performance. In this light, the king's bedroom was not private. It was political. Each act carried the weight of divine judgment. Each union confirmed or denied the prosperity of the kingdom. Yet the rituals also reveal how power manipulates belief. By framing intimacy as sacred duty, kings ensured their control was beyond question. Who could challenge a ruler chosen by the goddess herself? Who could resist a system where refusal was not defiance of man, but of heaven? This is how forbidden practices were normalized, wrapped in divinity, justified by survival, and recorded in clay as acts of cosmic necessity. The sacred marriage rite and its echoes across festivals demonstrate the Sumerian genius for merging glory with horror. They pioneered law, writing, and irrigation, but they also pioneered the ritualization of sexuality as governance. To understand their kingship is to accept that the same hands which inscribed the first codes of justice also inscribed hymns, commanding forbidden acts in the name of the gods. And this leads us deeper into the clay itself, where tablets preserve not only rituals of power, but also explicit instructions, metaphors, and hymns too shocking for early translators to reveal. What else did these tablets conceal? The answer lies in the next layer of discovery. The hidden practices preserved word for word in ancient Sumerian script. If the sacred marriage rite shocked modern readers, what lies deeper in the clay tablets is even more unsettling. Archaeologists, working in the ruins of Uruk, Nippur, and Ur, uncovered thousands of cuneiform fragments, contracts, hymns, receipts, and myths. Buried among them were texts that scholars at first hesitated to translate. They contained details so explicit, so startlingly candid about royal bedroom rituals that early excavators quietly tucked them away in archives. To reveal them risked shattering the myth of noble Sumer, the cradle of civilization. The tablets speak in the voice of the goddess Inanna and her mortal partners, describing ritualized unions with a vividness that erases any ambiguity. In one hymn, she praises the king's seed that waters the furrows of the land, a metaphor so literal that its agricultural veneer barely conceals its sexual nature. In others, step-by-step descriptions of ritual acts are framed as divine commands, the positioning of bodies, the order of touches, the recitation of sacred words. These were not allegories. They were instructions, inscribed by temple scribes who saw no conflict between governance and intimacy. Some texts read like ceremonial scripts. The priestess, embodying Inanna, calls upon the king to prove his virility, while attendants prepare offerings of beer, dates, and incense. Hymns praise the king's performance as proof of his legitimacy, blending adoration of the goddess with admiration for his body. What modern historians interpret as bedroom acts were, for the Sumerians, national duties written into clay. These rituals were so central that scribes immortalized them alongside royal decrees and military victories. embedding them into the very foundation of their civilization. What disturbed early translators was not only the content, but the candor. Unlike later cultures that cloaked sexuality in metaphor, the Sumerians recorded it openly. The goddess demands satisfaction, the king responds with action. Every gesture is sanctified, every detail elevated to cosmic importance. For scholars steeped in Victorian morality, these texts were unpublishable. Some were hidden in museum basements, for decades labeled vaguely as erotic hymns or unclassified fragments. Only in recent years have modern translations revealed their full explicitness. And still, questions remain. If so many tablets survived describing these rituals, how many more were deliberately suppressed? Archaeologists speculate that entire caches of texts may have been discarded or destroyed by later Mesopotamian cultures, embarrassed by their ancestors' openness. Babylonians and Assyrians borrowed Sumerian gods and myths, but often sanitized their rituals, turning Inanna into Ishtar, goddess of war and love, while erasing the most scandalous elements of her worship. This suggests that even in antiquity, Sumer's forbidden practices were deemed too dangerous to preserve intact. But what we do have is enough to reconstruct a hidden world. Beyond the sacred marriage rite, tablets hint at variations where the king's consorts were rotated through. Ritual roles, each embodying aspects of the goddess. Some hymns describe multiple participants, blurring the boundary between sacred union and orchestrated spectacle. Others detail offerings of food and drink woven directly into the acts, turning feasting and intimacy into a single performance of abundance. The king's ability to satisfy these elaborate demands was equated with the land's fertility. His private stamina mirrored in the harvests of his people. The conspiratorial undertone is impossible to ignore. Were these texts meant for posterity, or were they practical manuals for temple use? Did the scribes who recorded them believe they were preserving divine truth, or were they complicit in constructing propaganda that enshrined kings as God-chosen through their performance? The tablets blur the line between religion, politics, and pornography, leaving us to wonder how much was faith and how much was theatre. For modern readers, the most haunting aspect is not just the acts themselves, but the silence surrounding them. For thousands of years, generations grew up believing Sumer was a model of progress, unaware that buried in museum basements lay texts describing kings tested in their bedrooms as much as on their battlefields. The myth of civilization was carefully maintained, while the reality remained sealed in clay. This gap between myth and reality forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how history is curated. We are shown ziggurats, laws, and literature, but rarely the tablets that describe forbidden rites. Selective memory preserves glory while concealing horror. And if this is what we now know, what of the texts that remain untranslated or hidden from publication even today? Scholars quietly admit that not all Sumerian tablets have been released to the public. Some fragments remain unpublished in archives, raising the chilling question, what secrets still lie hidden, censored not by time but by choice? To uncover the legacy of these rituals fully, we must shift focus from kings and scribes to those who bore the greatest cost, the women forced to embody goddesses, to participate in ceremonies not of their choosing, and to disappear from history as individuals. Their silence shaped the myth of Sumer as much as the tablets themselves. The story of Sumerian kingship is not complete without the women who made the rituals possible. Yet, in the thousands of clay tablets unearthed, their individual voices are almost entirely absent. The hymns praise kings, the scribes glorify the gods, but the women themselves are reduced to roles. High priestess, consort, vessel, of Inanna. Their silence is as revealing as the rituals themselves. For while the kings were exalted, the women who embodied the divine were erased, absorbed into the machinery of legitimacy. The most prominent of these roles was the high priestess, often chosen from noble families. To the outside world, she held extraordinary prestige. She lived in temple complexes, led processions, and was honored as the earthly representative of Inanna. yet her status was inseparable from obligation. She was expected to perform the sacred marriage rite with the king to become the goddess's body for the sake of the state. This was not a choice but a duty, demanded by religion and politics alike. Beneath the veneer of divinity lay a reality of coercion, where individual desires were sacrificed to preserve power. Other women participated too, though their identities vanish into anonymity. Some tablets hint at attendants, consorts, or singers, involved in rituals where food, music, and sexuality merged. These women were never named. Their contributions were vital to the spectacle, but they were remembered only as parts of a ceremony, not as people. In this way, the women of Sumer became shadows in history, visible only in the outlines drawn by male scribes. The silence around their experiences was reinforced by later civilizations. Babylonians and Assyrians inherited much from Sumer, but stripped away its most explicit traditions. In their retellings, the goddess Ishtar retained her association with love and war, but the intimate rituals binding kings and priestesses were softened or erased. This selective editing ensured that the women who endured these practices would never be remembered as individuals. Their suffering became doubly erased, first in life, then in memory. Yet trauma does not vanish so easily. Cultural memory often preserves what chronicles erase. In folklore, faint echoes of these practices survived. Tales of women chosen by the gods, stories of brides sacrificed for the prosperity of the land. These narratives, told in metaphor and myth, hint at a collective unease, a memory of rituals that were too scandalous to record directly, yet too impactful to forget entirely. The very absence of personal testimony may itself be a sign of suppression, the deliberate silencing of voices that could challenge the myth of noble kingship. What is most disturbing is how power reframed these women's exploitation as divine honor. To be chosen as Inanna's vessel was presented as the highest privilege, a sacred calling. But privilege without agency is no privilege at all. The women were revered in public but controlled in private, trapped in a system where their bodies legitimized rule. The king's glory depended on their silence. Their individuality was consumed so thoroughly that history itself barely acknowledges them. This pattern raises a haunting question. How much of what we call civilization rests on silenced voices? Sumer gave the world writing, but those who suffered under its systems left no words of their own. It gave us law, but its laws did not protect the women bound to temples. It gave us myths of gods and kings, but erased the people sacrificed to maintain those myths. Civilization's foundations, it seems, were not only clay and stone, but also silence and trauma. The victim's absence from history is not an accident. It is part of the legacy of Sumerian kingship. By shaping the narrative to glorify rulers, scribes ensured that the cost of power would remain invisible. Yet in the gaps, in the lines left unwritten, we find the shadows of those forgotten lives. Their silence is itself a testimony, a reminder that behind every myth of glory lies a hidden empire of pain. As we move into the final section, we must ask, what is the legacy of these forbidden practices today? How have they shaped not just our understanding of Sumer, but the very way civilizations remember themselves? The story of the Sumerian kings does not end with their clay tablets crumbling in the dust. Their legacy lives on, not only in the inventions we celebrate, writing, mathematics, law, but also in the forbidden practices we prefer to forget. The sacred marriage rite, the hymns of Inanna, the erasure of women's voices. These are not curiosities locked in the past. They are reminders of how power is built, remembered, and disguised. For centuries, the myth of Sumer as the first civilization has been retold as a triumph of progress. Schoolbooks praise its irrigation canals, its cuneiform tablets, its temples reaching toward the heavens. Kings are described as shepherds of their people, the bringers of order to chaos. Yet buried beneath this myth are the rituals that forced intimacy into the service of rule. The same rulers who issued the first laws also enacted ceremonies that blurred devotion with domination. Their glory depended not just on military conquest, but on private acts turned into public theatre. This dual legacy forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that civilization's beginnings were not pure. Progress and exploitation advanced together. The invention of writing allowed laws and contracts to be recorded, but also preserved hymns that celebrated the king's intimate performances. Religion offered meaning and order, but also justified rituals where women were stripped of choice. What we celebrate as humanity's first steps forward were shadowed by acts we now recognize as coercive, even abusive. The influence of these forbidden practices did not end with Sumer. Later Mesopotamian cultures, from Babylon to Assyria, inherited their gods and myths while carefully editing their rituals. Ishtar replaced Inanna, and the sacred marriage was softened, transformed into symbolic union rather than explicit ceremony. Yet the structure remained. Rulers tied their legitimacy to fertility, intimacy, and divine favor. Echoes of Sumer's forbidden rites can even be found in Egyptian traditions of divine kingship, in Hittite fertility festivals, and in Roman myths where rulers claimed descent from gods. The details changed, but the principle endured. Power cloaks itself in ritual, even when that ritual demands silence from the vulnerable. What makes the Sumerian case unique is that their openness left a permanent record. Unlike later cultures, they inscribed their secrets on clay, believing them sacred, not scandalous. Thousands of years later, those tablets force us to confront truths that their descendants tried to bury. They remind us that history is never just about what is remembered, but also about what is deliberately forgotten. The myth of Sumer as noble cradle of civilization survives only because the forbidden side of their kingship was erased from popular memory. And yet, the forbidden legacy endures in ways we cannot escape. The genetic, cultural, and symbolic influence of these practices echoes through time. The silenced women of Sumer may not have left their words, but their absence speaks loudly. They reveal how power thrives not only on conquest, but also on control of narrative, deciding whose voices are recorded and whose are erased. That dynamic has repeated across history. Empires glorify their rulers while silencing their victims. Today, we stand in awe of Sumer's ziggurats and marvel at their tablets. But how often do we ask what those tablets concealed? How often do we consider that the very civilizations celebrated as humanity's beginning also pioneered the cover-up? The selective memory that preserves glory while hiding horror? The forbidden rituals of the Sumerian kings are more than scandalous curiosities. They are warnings etched into clay, reminders that every empire tells only part of its story. And so the question lingers: if these truths remained hidden for 5,000 years, what else lies buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia? What other secrets of the world's first kings are still waiting to be uncovered? Civilization began with Sumer, but perhaps it also began with silence.